as we design rooms into our house, why wouldn't we design rooms into our garden?
That's a really good question, Fleur. What is it about rooms and why wouldn't we design them into a garden, or why would we? Maybe that's what I should ask you.
Yeah, well, you've been to many of those Aussie backyards and they just have grass and hedge and fence. They don't feel right,
and
do
the hills hoist. You forgot the hills hoist.
And it's not in its own room, mind you.
True.
It's in the middle. But they lack a sense of invitation and journey. So we put in rooms because it creates spaces that are not only inviting, appealing, but have functions, and they just increase the feeling of space.
I would also add to it that they make your garden feel more organised and give it a real purpose, because when you design a room, just like you do in your house, you design a kitchen because that's where you're going to be cooking. You design a bathroom because that's where you're going to be washing. Right. So why wouldn't you do the same in a garden?
Yeah, and look, even in a house, you might have an open plan living space, but you still have the way you arrange your furniture. You still have an area for your lounge room, an area for your kitchen, and an area for your dining. So there's a really fabulous chapter in Michael McCoy's book, Dream Gardens, about a garden where the designers intentionally divide a large block into a series of small rooms so that you get this sort of an aperture, so you get this glimpse to the garden rooms beyond. And it's one of the designers in this space called Kendall Monk, and he says, it's a really great quote. He says, dividing a space up, if it's done well, through that sense of discovery can make the space feel bigger.
That's a really good reason to do a bit of garden room designing in your garden. Your hosts are longtime friends, Fleur and Sachi, that's me, who bring a fresh perspective and their life experience to designing gardens as a second career. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. Follow us on Spotify so you know when the next episode is available. And as you've heard, we're talking about creating outdoor rooms in your garden today. So what exactly, are we talking about properly here?
Yeah, so we're really looking at a larger space, and we're breaking that into a set of smaller spaces.
Now, I'm just going to challenge you there.
Mm-hmm.
So are we looking at just something that applies to a larger space?
No. In fact, when we look at a courtyard or a balcony, we can do the same thing. And so what it is, we're proportioning functions. We're sort of saying this side has a particular feel and a particular purpose, which may be different to that side. And it already gives you that sense that your brain can register, I get it, that's what I'm going to use that side for. That's what I'm going to use that side for. And the space just feels then organised and deliberate.
Yes, like we were talking about, purposeful.
Yeah.
So there are, I guess, and I don't want to use the word rules, although you do like your rules.
I do like rules. Guidelines, perhaps?
Guidelines, exactly.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things you want to be thinking about that are important when you're designing rooms, just like you would in your kitchen. Normally you wouldn't design a kitchen unless you're in a micro space that is under a particular size if you have more space available for you. So what are the guidance things that we want to be thinking about for outdoor rooms?
Yeah, look, I want to start with this out there. It's a bit theoretical, but I think you stick with me because this will give us the bones on which we can then develop more conversation about. And that is, I just want to put out there 2 guidelines for listeners, and that is, 1 is the golden ratio, and 2
not
is...
the golden triangle, like we talk about in some other thing.
No, this is not Bermuda and the planes are not falling from the sky. This is the golden ratio. And then the second one was the law of significant enclosure. And I've picked these 2 because they will give listeners and, designers, anyone who wants to have a go at this, some guidelines to how to recognise the ideal proportion of space. Okay.
Good, go.
Right. So let's think about the golden ratio first. This sounds complicated because it kind of is a bit, but it's this perfect ratio, and the ratio is 1.618. Okay, think of that. 1.618.
And that is the meaning of life.
That is it. That is, everything's solved apparently.
That's
through
right.
That.
Well, I was just going to say, if you can explain this to me, then you've explained it to anyone.
Okay, let me give it a go. Let me give my best shot. Okay, so in the landscape design context, the golden ratio is about creating spaces that have ideally balanced dimensions. Okay, so this is a really good start stage. So what we mean by this is we can create rooms where their relative width is balanced with their length.
Yep.
So we're kind of thinking rectangles here. You can apply the golden ratio in other ways, but rectangles to a point where it feels pleasing. Okay. So let me give you an example because
Yes.
I'm getting a bit of a blank stare here.
You are. I'm wondering where the 1.68 or whatever it came in.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked because I'm about to reveal. So I think an example is really useful in this case. So just say you've got a long, skinny backyard. Maybe it's shallow and wide or long and thin. And some people have these, particularly sort of townhouse kind of arrangements. Just say for the purpose of the example, it is 5 metres wide and 20 metres long. Okay? Now, we know when you stand on that deck and you look at that space, you're seeing everything at once and it's not interesting. But we want to break that into functional areas. So if we apply the golden ratio and say we want to keep that 5 metre width, then we take 5 and you multiply it by the golden ratio. 5 times 1.618.
618. Okay.
Now, because I just did the maths before, that equals just over 8.
You could have really impressed me and said, made up like you'd done that in
and
your
then
head.
bam in my head because I'm just so
A whiz.
mathematically clever.
That's right.
Yeah.
I would have questioned it, don't worry.
Oh, good, because no one's ever told me I'm mathematically clever. So what we've got now is we've got a 5 metre wide garden and space, and we've multiplied by the golden ratio, and that's given us 8. So now what it's saying to us is 5 metre wide by 8 metres long is a really
ratio.
nice size for that width. That's right. So perfect dimensions. Now, we talked about in this context that the garden's 20 metres long. Okay, so we've got 8 metres plus 8 would be 16, and then we've got this sort of 4
random bit at the end.
So what I then say is what you can do is you create a 5 by 8 metre length. Then you've got a 4 metre transitional space. So that could be an arbour with planted garden beds on either side. And you come into a sort of squeeze, and then you come back out into the back 5 metre by 8 metre garden room.
Golden rectangle,
That's
triangle
it.
in my head. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you can kind of see instantly we've taken that one space, we've divided it into 2, and you put a nice transition in the middle. So instantly there's something that invites you to that back room. And the front room area might be functional for your barbecue, al fresco type of space, but the back area might be a much more relaxed and refuge space.
Cozy nook or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, and obviously this the golden ratio or the golden rectangle is actually something, because I was talking to someone that I know who did anthropology, shout out Brian, and he was saying this is actually something that was used by ancient civilizations as well. So it's been around for a very long time. We're not making it up. It is something that the proportions just appeal to the human aesthetic and feel.
That's right. It's tried and tested, and it goes back to, it's related to the Fibonacci sequence as well, which you see repeated in nature constantly, and so that's probably why it's a pleasing thing for the human.
Well, you did a good job in explaining it to me, Fleur.
Yeah,
I just need to remember the actual number. 1.618. 618.
You can Google it, I'm sure.
No, oh God, I already got it wrong. Yes, I will.
Anyway,
I'll write
that's
it down.
my understanding. And I think it's interesting when I sort of look at designs I've done, I've sort of intuitively used those kind of spaces anyway. So now the second one I wanted to talk about was the law of significant enclosure. Because if we're going to make garden rooms, a room implies you've got a floor, walls, and potentially a ceiling of some sort. So with insignificant enclosure, this is all about the ratio of the horizontal to the vertical planes. So
we're talking 3D now.
We're talking 3D. So we've got our ideal square or ideal rectangle.
Rectangle, yep.
And now we want to work out how high do the dividers go between the rooms. Now, if you've got so the law of significant enclosure is a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, what that means is 3 horizontal, 1 vertical. So let me give you a practical example.
Exactly.
Just say, let's go really, really easy. Just say you've got a 3 metre wide space. Mm-hmm. The height of your wall should be...
Don't look at me.
3 to 1. 3 to 1.
Okay, 3 to 1. I don't know.
1 metre.
No, because I can't work out where the 3 goes versus the 1.
Okay.
That was my issue.
3 is the horizontal. So think the floor is 3 metres wide.
Yep.
And the height of that wall should be no more than 1 metre.
Right.
And the reason for that is a 3 metre by, say if you have a 3 metre by 3 metre space, that's small.
Yes, it is very small.
If the wall's any higher than 1 metre, you feel
too enclosed.
Too enclosed.
Yes.
And it's not a good feeling. So just say then we go into a 9 by 9 metre space. Like you think of it, that could be quite an easy sized backyard lawn, 9 by 9 metre. The height there that's acceptable is 3 metres.
Yes.
Okay. So because you've got much more open space, you're taking up a hedge or trees or canopy or something to 3 metres is more acceptable. The human brain accepts that as a feeling of pleasing enclosure.
Yes, and I think we probably need to differentiate between what we're talking is something that is largely connected with the floor and gives you a feeling of sides, because we're not talking necessarily about your ceiling, because obviously it's not going to work with your ceiling.
No, we're talking about the height of the walls or the screening or maybe the hedging or the
just
trees on the side.
Just in case someone was going to try and build a little dwarf outfit, because it's not going to work. You'll be crawling in if you've got a small space. So there, I guess, the guidance elements that we need to be thinking about. Let's get into the how do we actually build something like this. And I guess I almost want to think about it like we would build a room. So what are the things that you think about when you think about the floor, walls and ceiling?
Yeah. Should we start with the floor?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Build up from there.
Absolutely. So floor, okay. Floor outside in a garden space, what could that be?
Well, I mean, immediately I would say very generally it can be either hardscaping material or it could be softscaping, i.e. plants.
Yeah.
So you could use a wood deck, you could have flagging stones or paving, or you could have mulch, or you could have turf, or you could have gravel. All of those things can create your floor.
Yeah.
Anything like that.
Yeah, lawn,
Yep,
I think you
that's
said
right.
ground
Turf.
covers.
Yeah,
that's right.
And I think the other thing is obviously if you already have a space outside, you might have like some people have these massive decks. You might actually want to create a garden or a room that starts to break your deck up into bits that are more usable and create a bit more interest than just a big, flat, open space.
Yeah, look, that's so true. And a lot of people do have unusually large decks.
They do. I've got one of them and it's a bit useless in bits. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I say to people, like, how would you, look inside, how have you broken up your open plan living space? So we need to have this area is where your, comfy couches are, and this area is where your open air dining is.
That's right.
And
Or your fireplace or whatever it might be. That's right. Or your bean bags for the kids to sit.
Yeah. And sometimes it might be a wall that actually divides the two spaces where you've got, one of those great fire features that you can see from both sides.
Yeah, and there's nothing to stop you from doing something similar in a outdoor space as well. So that's really the floor. Is there anything else you'd say around a floor?
No, I think we've covered floor.
I think the only other thing I thought about was if you do have something like a large deck or a large hard paved area, you can get outdoor rugs. So you can use that to help define your garden room as well. If you don't necessarily have the capacity to put up, lots of wall-like stuff, you might want to help define your space with that rug.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, you triggered me to another one as well, and that is the use of contrast paving.
Oh, good idea, yes.
Yeah, if you do have a lot of hardscaping, having a kind of a header soldier course edge that defines a space that might be like a 4x4 metre space, and then even though the paving continues, you feel just by having that border around your paving means that you step over that border, which you're not stepping over anything, it's flat, but it gives you that mental kind of transition. I've gone into another space now.
So what was the border you just talked about?
A header course or a soldier course, which is like when you get a whole lot of smaller pavers and they're lined up.
So basically you're almost doing like parquetry, where you have a distinctive different design in your paving pattern.
Yes, that's right. Or something that is a border around the edge.
Yeah. And you could do the same even with if you had a large expanse, say, of gravel or pebbles, you could also do a different texture or a different colour to help define a space which might be your floor for your room.
Yeah, that's great. So ground planes are just as important because you really want to the ground plane, what's happening on the ground is breaking up those spaces into rooms even before we've put the walls in.
Exactly. So we're starting from the bottom up. So let's get on to the walls. So what are you thinking about walls? I guess one thing I did want to mention very quickly though is when we're talking about a room, it doesn't have to be fully enclosed. We're just talking about the feel of a room, not that it has to be a room like in a house, because we're in the garden. Most cases you don't necessarily need to have something that's, say, watertight like you would in a house. I don't think there's many houses where you have a non-watertight room.
Yeah, well,
which would be kind of weird.
That's right. That's right. In your garden rooms, you may have a covered arbour or a studio out in the garden or a glass house or something that is covered. But by and large, most of the rooms are just defined by a
suggestion of something.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
So what would you use for walls?
Yeah, I think walls are fascinating because you can have such a range. You can have block work, like painted rendered block, which is heavy and non-transparent, right through to, you've got Rio mesh screens that have a light vine climbing up them. And one thing I think is lovely in that is cutting in windows. So you've got this aperture into another space. That's very enticing.
And in fact, we've got a photo, which I'll put up on our Instagram for this, because Redford Park has a fantastic outdoor room where they've actually created a sofa in plants with a lampshade, and they have a wall with a window where you can look into the outdoor room as well. So we'll put that up as a photo. It's an extreme of an outdoor room because it really is an indoor room brought outside, but it is a good instance, I guess, of what you could potentially do if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's playful.
So
Suggestive.
what you were just saying, I think there's actually some questions you might want to ask yourself about your walls. So it kind of depends on your goals. So do you want structural privacy? Do you want to make it more intimate, or do you want it something that's blending subtly with the rest of the garden? Those are the kind of questions you want to be asking yourself.
Absolutely. And if you have too many privacy walls, you're going to feel quite enclosed. So sometimes you have to have that sort of lighter footprint and maybe it's just trees that create a little bit of concealment, but a lot of airflow and light goes through them still. I mean, I'm thinking of things like birch that are just very lightly foliaged.
That's right. So we've learned not to put birch into our gardens in Canberra, though, everyone. Just remember the last couple of episodes back there.
Thank you, Attila, for that reminder.
That's right.
But they're the kind of, light sort of... and then you can have hedging, which is very heavy and
dense,
thick.
Yes.
But coming back to this decision, the decision may be made for you by the available space. So as soon as you put a hedge in, you're taking away, maybe about 80 centimetres of ground plane. But if you put a Rio mesh fence in, you're taking away 5-10 centimetres.
And I guess it also depends where your room is going, because you might actually already have you might be using a boundary fence, and that's, a wall in your garden.
Yeah.
So again, it's a bit about where you situate things as well that might dictate what your walls look like.
Yeah.
And where you have them.
That's right. And, in a different room's going to want to have a different feeling. There might be spaces that you do want to have this sense of a real intimacy, enclosure. Maybe you have a lot of canopy type of trees, and when you walk in that, you're immersed into this sort of shaded refuge space. But in other spaces, that's not appropriate, where you want to feel airy and light and a bit connected to other areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the other thing, if we go back to what we were talking about before, say if you had a big hardscape space, either paving or decking or something, you don't have to put things that grow as your walls either. You can use things like potted plants. They could potentially create your wall, or you could actually have, a low stone wall or something built into it to create that sense that there's a divider and some kind of a wall too.
Oh, the apple step over.
Oh, the apple step over, that's right. For those that don't know, there is a thing called an apple step over.
Not the apple turnover.
No, that's right.
And it basically is just espaliering apples quite low to the ground. So it's about 30 centimetres to 50 centimetres high. You can step over them, but you've got a productive little wall. That's what that's referring to.
That's exactly right. But obviously screens and fences are your obvious choice as well for some walls. So I think the other thing to just remember about the walls is you need to be thinking about your entries and exits into your room, because you want to be thinking about your flow as well. So how are you going to get into this room? How are you going to get out of the room? Yeah. And luckily you don't really have to worry about fire escapes. So it really is about how you want to use the room. So be planning that at the same time you're thinking about what your walls and materials might be.
I always, when I'm designing, I like to have at least 2 entrance exits out of every room, because I feel that if you come into a room...
you don't want to be trapped.
That's right, I don't want to be trapped. But also I think that adds to journey. So if you go into a dead end, it's like you're in a maze. You go to a dead end, you feel that sort of, I've got to turn around. Whereas if you're going into a room that gives you another option, it's like, where does that go?
Where does that go? That's right.
And that actually creates this sense that the whole space is bigger than it is, because you're moving through the garden in a a way that you start to not get a good sense of where you've come from and where you're going.
Yes.
So it makes your journey a lot longer. It's
that
like
is
when I
very
play
true.
golf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then again, you might...
All over the place.
Right. There's no walls there either. Gee, hate to see you with a golf ball in walls. But I guess the other thing is that with entries and exits, if you want to have a really cosy thing, you might actually only have one entrance. You know, that it goes back to this, what's the function of your room as well?
Yeah, good point. And I think in those spaces, that's where you have destination points.
Yes.
So if you're going into that, you know, there's one entrance in, one entrance, one exit, then there's going to be seating in there. There's going to be something that invites you to linger and stay, pause, those sort of things. So that creates a whole ambience, and that's the function. The function
purpose,
is a destination spot in your garden.
And I think the other thing is you don't have to have 4 walls. So, you know, you might have some taller walls and you might have some shorter suggestions of walls. You don't feel like when you're creating a room it has to be the 4-wall ceiling and floor.
Yeah, and you know what? It doesn't have to be rectilinear either.
No.
So what sometimes I've done curved arbours.
Yes.
And I tell you, they create a beautiful journey because you can see at the beginning of the arbour that it's curved, but you can't see the end of it. So it invites you in and you have a whole new experience as you come out the other side.
That's a lovely idea.
Yeah, and particularly if you've got, you got clematis or vines
That's
or
right,
something
something
growing over
overhead.
it.
Yeah.
And that's and that adds to, while we're talking about flow, this sense of coming into a tighter space and then opening out into an...
This is one of Fleur's favourites. It's what is it? The
squeeze and release.
Yeah, squeeze and release.
And it's not to do with your glute exercises.
Which is immediately what springs into my mind. So how about we go into ceilings? What would you do for ceilings?
Well, ceiling's an interesting one in a garden because quite often you really don't do a ceiling unless you've got a canopy that is a tree canopy, or you're actually going into a space that has got a artificial roof, like a
hardscaped roof,
yes.
like a pergola or an awning, or you're building a structure that just is a suggestion of a roof.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and but really, I think some of the good canopy sort of methods, if you want to create a bit of a cozy space but you don't want your trees to go too tall, particularly those on boundaries where you're going into power lines or hanging over the neighbour's yard, which you might not want to do, is you get those grafted trees, and they're on a 1.8 metre standard, and they will only grow sort of about 3 metres wide, 3 metres high at the most, and
like
it just
creates
umbrella. An umbrella. It's
yes.
a living umbrella in your
or
garden.
a big mushroom.
A big mushroom would be like, I think of them as sort of like big beach umbrellas, but you don't have to, they don't wear out like if you had
That's true, something fabric.
Those canvas umbrellas.
Weathered. Yeah, absolutely. I actually have to say I really like in rooms that you don't always have, you have more of a hint of a ceiling. You don't actually have a ceiling. And I was thinking some of the most, I guess, effective things that I've seen used even is like a string of fairy lights, which starts to suggest that there's something overhead.
I like that.
But there is nothing really substantive about it.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of a garden I went to in the Robinson's Garden in New Zealand, and it was a series of arches, and they were metal welded arches, and they were about maybe 1.5 metres apart from each other, but you walked under them. They didn't have any climbing vines on them. It wasn't a roof, but the sense of walking through it and under it made you feel that there was a
something
enclosure.
enclosed.
It was very pleasing.
And there is something, and I'll use the big word, there is an anthropogenic, exactly, that's right, comfort in having a sense of enclosure, which also goes to why there is a guidance around, how you actually design that enclosure so you don't feel trapped. But we do like to have things around us as humans.
It's very safe and protected.
It is, absolutely. I think the other thing that it's useful to think about what is going to be your sort of ceiling-like structure, I'll put that into inverted commas, ceiling, is that it's also the area where you are adding that vertical interest to your garden, because you do want to be taking a step back and thinking about not just the room you're building, how does it fit with your broader garden? Yeah. And you always want to be thinking about the layers that you have in your garden, and you always want to have some kind of vertical structural interest, not just all at 1 or 2 layers that are lower.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, because when I was reading Michael McCoy's book, and it was he talks about how interrupting sight lines has a powerful effect of keeping your attention placed in that space.
Did you just remember that?
Yes, yes. Because
I'm impressed.
Because it's so interesting because we have this idea that you want to always see the borrowed view, or you want to see straight down, an avenue or something. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes there's nothing to look at.
That is very true, particularly in Australia where we just might have miles and miles of very flat land.
Yeah, or looking into your neighbour's garden.
Washing line.
And
Yes.
so this idea of actually interrupting the sight lines is quite beautiful because it brings you back into the space you're in. So if your sight lines are interrupted, it forces your eyes to slow down and see what's right there and what's with you. So it creates just a much more gentle movement through a garden. So I'd say, having those vertical screening points, you might want to frame a view, I'll have those windows, but interrupting the longer view is good.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
it's actually quite a clever way to
create interest.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think we just need to take a step back from the actual room itself now and think about what are the things that you also need to think about when you're connecting the rooms and how you're laying them out. One of the things for me is always, and this goes back to making sure that we're thinking about our principles more generally, is that there is some kind of a seamless integration from your house into your garden. So even though you're creating these rooms, you probably don't want to have, if you've got a very modern house, you probably don't want to all of a sudden have, and I don't know how to describe this, but a very ye olde worldy room in your garden. So you want to keep your feeling the same, and you want to think about your proportions again and the scale relative to the house too.
Yeah, it's the landscape architects and designers always talk about the house is the dominant form. It's there first, and the landscape needs to respond to the house. And in many cases, when that's done respectfully, it works so well. Sometimes, you're in a modern house, but you just desperately want a rose garden, a cottage garden.
That's right.
Then maybe that's where you can room it up. And in the far part of the garden where it's all nice and bright and sunny, you walk into this rose parterre or something like that.
And it's a distance from the house.
Yeah,
that might be the way to deal with those things. But let's talk quickly about the transitions and the layout, because I think that's really important here too. You can build the best room in the world, but if it doesn't have the right connectivity with other parts of your garden or your house, then you're not going to use it.
Yeah. So it needs to be, just like in your house, it needs to be purposeful. It needs to have, and it can be many things. You just work out what that function is. Maybe it's just a place to pause and reflect. Maybe it is a fire pit and it's got a deliberate function. Maybe it's a play area for the kids. Maybe it's your vegetable patch.
Maybe it's a yoga studio.
Oh, love that.
So do I. I want one of them. That's going to be my next room.
And so as long as it's got, it signals to the brain to say, this is what this function's for. Am I doing that today? No, I'm going to move on to this other place. But that's okay because you're having a journey through it. So transitions, destinations, slow spots, apertures, these are all part of the flow of creating the garden rooms.
I think that's very true. And I'd say for me, there are some things that I always look for. If you've got an area that, say, is like your dining room area, put it closest to your house, because then you won't be running in and out, bringing things back and forth from the kitchen, unless there is a really good reason not to, obviously. But I would also say with those transitions, and this almost goes back to some of those principles that we were talking about when we were talking about Japanese-style gardens. How do you signal that you're moving from one place to another? And one room with a different purpose to another. Yeah. So they are really important spaces, those transition spaces. And it might even come down to you have an arbour, and that sort of signals that you're moving through something into something else. But it might be as simple as you move from one material underfoot to a gravel, and all of a sudden you get a crunch under your feet, and that signals that you're moving into another space.
Right, it's a different sensory experience.
That's right.
Yeah, and it also can come into that squeeze and release.
Exactly.
And a question I want to throw back to you, because we've got to start wrapping up, and that is, can dividing a garden up be done badly?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've got an example that you can give us, because you're just itching to give it to us.
Well, it's just that, this is not the, be-all, end-all solution for everyone, just dividing your garden up. You've got to think about it purposefully.
Yes.
So, if the spaces are poorly proportioned, for example, it's going to be done badly. If you, therefore, if you don't consider your golden ratio and your law of significant enclosure. But secondly, if you try to fit too much in a room, and this comes back to our conversation on function. So if that's a fire pit, let it be a fire pit.
Don't make it a library at the same time.
No, you don't want to burn
it's also
those books.
flammable. Exactly.
But, and there's areas that, if you clutter it too much, then you go into that space and you just feel it's too busy. It's overwhelmed. And people particularly do this poorly in small spaces like decks, patios and courtyards.
It becomes everything to everyone.
That's right. So you've got to be very deliberate. The smaller space, the more of a challenge. Be very deliberate. So if you're dividing up spaces, be very deliberate and quite discerning about what goes in them and get the proportions of what's in that space to the size of the space right.
And I would also say you do need to think about the materials you're using as well, because the materials will really help you create the different feels that you might want in your room, because you might be creating a nook where there's a really nice little place to sit and read. You possibly don't want that to be hard concrete. You might want to make it a much more softer, I guess, with some furnishings and some wood, which is a softer texture. So think about your materials as well, because they will really help you understand and make it very clear the purpose of your room. I think we have gone breakneck speed through this. There's so much to say about rooms.
I feel like we only just started.
I do too. But I think the key takeaway from me before I hand to you was keep in mind your garden design principles, because they apply in rooms just as much as anything else. So you are thinking about your unity, your scale, your proportion and your balance, all of those very important things. What are your takeaways, Fleur?
Well, definitely on the proportion and use those guidelines of the golden ratio or golden rectangle and the law of significant enclosure. And secondly would be the flow. So it's one thing to have rooms, but if you don't flow a natural connection through them, if you don't connect the spaces and create some journey, then you're not getting it.
So important.
Flow, transitions, fabulous.
You heard it from Fleur. It's all about the flow. Well, we're going to wrap up now. It's been great talking to you. Follow us on Instagram and find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us so you know when the next episode is.
Happy designing.
Happy designing. See you later.